last day of school is supposed to feel safe, a celebration, a relief, a goodbye. But for some students, their final day became something far worse. A day they still can't talk about. A day they wish they didn't survive. Tonight on Mr. Dark Horror Stories, I'll share 3 very scary, true last day of school horror stories. Disturbing real experiences that happened during the one day everyone let their guard down. If you love realistic, dark, true horror, subscribe and hit the bell. Because tonight, school doesn't end when the bell rings. Story 1. The last day of senior year should have been the loudest day of my life. Everyone said it would be. Confetti and caps, shouting and hugs, the kind of exhausting jubilation you only really feel once, and then tuck away like some childish keepsake. But for me, it hung like a flat note. The halls were bright with posters, "Congrats, seniors!" and the courtyard smelled like cheap pizza and sunscreen, and students posed in ridiculous group photos with arms thrown over shoulders. But the noise felt like it was happening in another room. A week had already made the whole place feel smaller. We'd all been watching the clock because we wanted whatever came after this building to come fast and loud and forgiving. But there was an empty rectangle in the back of a room 312 that day where the noise did not reach. It absorbed it instead. The night before, a senior, Maya Thomas, hadn't come home. A week later, we were still doing the work, grief and rumor do, filling the missing places with stories to make the absence less sharp. Some said she'd run away. Some said she'd gotten into an accident out on Old County Road. Someone else muttered about the new factory on the edge of town and the men who worked nights. No one had answers, only patterns of where to look for them. Maya's desk was one of those old student desks with the wooden top nicked along the edges and the small storage space beneath that smelled faintly of glue and pencil shavings. It sat in the last row, by the window where the late sun poured in and turned dust into gold. I'd noticed it at the end of class last week. Her bag still there, untouched. People stopped leaving things on desks when someone disappeared. It felt too much like leaving a sign while you waited for the person to come back. On the last day, the teacher, Mr. Keene, gave a speech that tried to be both celebratory and careful. He kept glancing at the back of the room. You could see in the way he folded his hands and shifted his weight that he had nowhere to put his worry. The students buzzed over college acceptances and summer plans. Teachers said goodbye with practiced warmth, as if they'd rehearsed a life for all of us caught in the same 10th of a second of adulthood. But my eyes kept drifting to that desk, to the small curve of the chair, to the empty space beneath where Maya should have slid her legs in like she used to, tucking her feet beneath the chair like she always did when she was thinking. We all knew Maya in the way students know other students. The nickname she'd hate, her handwriting, the way she laughed too loud at the worst bits of the teacher's jokes. She wasn't class president or valedictorian. She liked drawing on her notes and wore a single silver ring on the middle finger of her left hand, the kind of ring that used to belong to her mother, she'd told anyone who asked. She drew animals with tiny, exact feathers and labeled them in a handwriting you could read at 50 paces. I'd sat behind her in physics, and once during a lab she'd turned and handed me a folded note with a crude cartoon of the teacher as a beetle. "For the laughs, Dee," it said. I kept it for months because it was the kind of small currency that made a school feel like something shared. The day smelled like late spring and varnish and the sweat of 100 teenagers holding in their goodbyes. We laughed at the teacher's jokes. We took pictures. We signed shirts. We wrote notes and traded them like talismans. The feeling at the end of that day should have been a release. For most of the class, it was. For me, it was a thin wire of unease, such a small, constant thing that I almost mistook it for a quirk of being awake. When the bell for final dismissal rang, I gathered my things with the motion of someone who had done it 100 times. I was late to meet my parents. The car would be waiting with the engine idling, an unspoken promise that life kept moving. I zipped my backpack and sauntered to the back row, because subconsciously, or perhaps not so subtly, I wanted to be the last one out. An excuse to stand there with my hands in my pockets, taking everything in that I might never see again. That's when I heard it. A tapping. Rapid, desperate. The kind of rhythm made by a pencil being stabbed at the edge of a desk with all the frustration and urgency someone might have in them. It was a sound I'd walked past 100 times in that room, but never alone. In music, it might be called a staccato plea. In the language of strangers, it's a noise that makes you look. I turned automatically and saw the pencil moving on the wooden top of Maya's desk. Not just moving, vibrating like a thing alive. There was no hand holding it. The pencil skittered and hopped, leaving tiny graphite smears in its wake. The movement was too frantic to be just a breeze or an uneven surface. It had intent, an insistence of motion identical to the panic I felt under my skin. "Hey," I said, because that's what we do. We name what is curious until the curiosity becomes safe. "Hey, guys." No one seemed to hear the pencil. People were collapsing into groups, shouting into phones, wiping mascara-streaked faces with the backs of their hands. The pencil tapped and hopped like a heartbeat you could see. I took a step closer because stepping still makes a thing more real, doesn't it? Actions anchor you in suspicion like a rope. I reached out before I could think better of it. The pencil was warm. Not the kind of warmth that comes from sunlight, but an angry, recent heat, like something that had been clutched. My fingers closed around it, and I felt the tremor in my own hand match the movement of the graphite. Under the pencil, where it had been skittering across the wood, was a single sheet of paper, half pulled out from under the lip of the desk. Someone had been writing, and then, on the paper, written in small, shaky handwriting I knew at once, because I'd seen it on a test once when she'd been so nervous she'd pressed her fist down. The words read, "I never made it home." There are sentences that refuse to be ordinary. That line set off fireworks behind my skull. The world immediately contracted so that all I could see was the grain of the desk and the way the letters trembled like a person trying not to cry. I looked up from the sheet, ready, idiot that I was, to find the prankster who'd managed this trick. Someone would be laughing. Someone would have the nerve to act like this was clever and cute to scare us in the middle of our last day. There would be a hidden camera, a friend with a smirk, somebody ready to break the tension with a punchline. The desk was empty. Not just the chair. The storage box beneath had been opened and was bare. Not a bag, no water bottle, no sketchbook. Pieces of Maya's life, the small things that make people know they'll be back, were gone, like someone had taken them with the door to something else. The pencil in my hand hummed with heat like it was still agitated from running. I felt the paper crumple slightly beneath my fingers, as if I had caught an animal mid-leap. My voice came out thin. "Where did you get this?" I asked, because somewhere you have to ask, even if the answer will be worse than silence. No one answered. The classroom made the kind of noise schools make when they are trying very hard to be happy and forgetful. The bell backstage called our names and told us to go. I tucked the paper inside my notebook, as though enclosing the line might keep it from expanding, the way a bandage stops blood from spreading. Outside the room, the sun was obnoxious and bright. People poured into the courtyard like a river. I said goodbye to a couple of friends who had that narcotic brightness you get only when you believe the future is going to be easy. I tried to act like I was part of them. My palms were damp from the paper in my bag, and I could feel the graphite on my fingers, smudged into the creases. I had an ugly knowledge then that real fear has a taste to it. metallic, a little like penny, and it trailed through the back of my mouth. That afternoon, the story rippled through the school in the way nothing else could. Whispered, then loud, then strange. Someone had left a note. Someone had written the one sentence on a page that made a whole school ache. Someone had found it on Maya's empty desk. They closed room 312 for the day. My friend said it was out of respect. The administration said it was because they needed to preserve the space as a part of their investigation. The principal wore a face like a person who had practiced sorrow and had made it into something dull and safe. They put up that blue tape around the door like someone who expects police on television, like the whole thing would become serious because they had used the right shade. There were rumors, as there always are. Maybe Maya had left a note explaining everything and then gone. Maybe she'd written it as a dare. Someone said it had been written earlier and it had only worked its way to the surface. Someone else said, because someone else always says it, that she'd been taken by someone who knew her patterns. I almost did what everyone does in novels and movies. I almost ripped off the tape and took the classroom back. But I didn't. Instead, I waited. 2 nights later, the school organized a memorial service in the auditorium. Students and teachers filed in and sat like popcorn kernels in a bowl. The principal's voice shook in places and was mercifully ordinary. People who never spoke read prepared lines about community and safety, about holding space. They dimmed the lights in a way that made faces into silhouettes. A candle on stage seemed more important than the candle in the back of my chest that kept flickering. A photograph of Maya, smiling, toothy, middle part in place, was projected on the screen behind the principal, and everyone leaned forward like looking could make absence return. They asked if anyone from her class would like to speak. A policeman stood in the wings. They said he wanted to ensure everything ran smoothly. I thought of the paper burning a hole in my notebook. I thought of the pencil warming my palm, as if it still had a pulse. I walked up. People looked surprised. Perhaps they thought the missing girl's friends would be in pieces. Maybe they expected sobbing. I kept my face steady because the last day of school had taught us to perform our lives like polished objects. No one wants to see the seam. I cupped my hands around the microphone like a man who has never had to use one before, and then, because silence in a room with 200 people is an instrument, I read what I had found. I said the line out loud. I never made it home. The room leaned as though the sentence could fall. In the tight dark, hands touched shoulders like people searching for bone to hold. Someone muttered reckless theology about it being a cry for help. Someone else cursed the world in a way that made people nod. The policeman afterward asked me questions. What did the handwriting look like? And I told him what I knew. He took the page from my notebook like a man who could weigh a page for truth. Outside, students circled on the lawn like vultures. The investigation moved like bureaucracies move. Phone numbers were given and checked. Cameras near the exits were scrutinized. The sheriff came to my house and asked me what I'd had for lunch the day before Maya disappeared. He asked me if I remembered anything unusual. I found things to tell him. Tiny things that felt like amenities to an investigation. I saw a truck idling by the gas station. I noticed a tire flap at the edge of the road, but he would only write down a fraction of what I said, and the fraction he wrote made sense only in the geometry of his report. Weeks turned into months. The paper in my bag grew, soft. The blue tape faded from the classroom. People began to collage their own lives again, and the missing became another story folded into the background. But the desk remained. Custodians polished the floor around it. Parents came and left. Flowers appeared sometimes, wilted in their bronze vases. The room felt like a place you could enter in both ways, the past that had been interrupted and the present stubbornly trying to continue. I stopped going to homeroom. I walked the long way around the school. I told friends I needed to study, that college apps had to get my attention. But the truth was, I could not stand to sit at my desk and look at the empty one in the row behind me. The pencil tapping kept replaying in my head, warm graphite under my fingertips like evidence of a living thing. I often imagined the vibration of it as a shape, my shape, or hers, slipping between the lines of life we all pretend are rigid and unchanging. Months later, the school organized a memorial in room 312 again. They insisted they wanted to honor what had been taken. People brought candles and balloons, and finally, as if being done with the waiting gave them courage, they carried the desk to the front of the auditorium. They set it on the stage like an altar. Parents in the front row wiped their faces. A teacher read words about closure and how sometimes the only way to heal is to acknowledge what is missing. As the lights dimmed, I felt a pressure in my throat that was not only grief but an accusation I could not place. After the ceremony, someone, one of the more sentimental band kids, took the desk home and put it in his garage as a memorial, because that's the kind of thing people do when a public grief refuses to stop being private. They said the desk needed to be somewhere safe. I don't know what happened to the paper. I never saw it again after that first week. Sometimes I think the pencil wrote itself and the desk was trying to tell us something too late. Sometimes I think I made the whole thing real by touching the pencil and sliding the note into my notebook. Or maybe someone with fingers the wrong kind of calm had used a trick to get us to look. Someone who thought words like that had the power to make even a whole school feel like a body part missing. I never went back to room 312. The building I left that year was full of faces I didn't know how to read anymore, and I carried the memory of the tapping like a small bruise that shows up only when something presses on it. Years later, when I drove past my high school town, the building looked like a paper model held together by gossip and paint. I wondered if the kids walking inside had any idea that silence can be as loud as shouting. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is too quiet and the city is a warm, oblivious hum, I take a pencil from the drawer. The graphite leaves a mark that looks like any other, but I never slide the page across the desk. I set it on my knee and think of a girl's handwriting, steady as a pulse, splayed across a wooden top. I suppose I keep the memory because the line keeps refusing to fold into any neat phrase. It sits like a lodged thing, simple, unavoidable, and never truly explained. I never made it home. If some answer ever exists, I haven't found it. And so I keep my distance from schoolrooms and stages and any old desks that look like they remember too much, because the pencil still vibrates in my mind, an insistence that somewhere, someone is still trying to get back. Story 2. The last day of school should have felt like the end of something small and private, a locker closing, a laugh that keeps living in your head. Instead, for me, it tightened into a single thin memory I still wake up to sometimes. A bustling gym full of banners and balloons and people I'd known since I was 13, and one desk in the back of the room 214 that refused to belong to the celebration. We were in the ritual of it all. Yearbooks passed like contraband, Sharpies uncapped, kids scrawling signatures that would one day look like handwriting from another lifetime. People traded jokes and promises, and the kind of small betrayals that are called remember me's. My friends were loud in the corner, and the teacher had mercifully handed in his resignation to anything resembling decorum. I moved through the slow current of students, signing with the polite, forgettable messages. Good luck, stay weird, don't change, the scripts everyone tries so hard to mean. She was seated in the last row, desk pushed slightly out from the others, as if it had been nudged later by hands that cared more for distance than for show. Her hair spilled over her shoulders in a plain, unassuming way. Her clothes were ordinary, sweatshirt, jeans, but there was something old about the way she sat, a small, deliberate stillness I'd never seen in anyone at our school. She didn't have a yearbook on her desk, just a folded sheet of paper and a pencil lying still. When I came to her desk, she looked up like she'd been waiting. "You're signing?" she asked, and there was a tremor in her voice I didn't place at first. "Sure," I said, smiling like you do when your palms smell of gym floor dust and you want everything to be light. I signed the front cover. She watched me do it. When I pushed the yearbook back across the desk, she reached forward with the same small, careful movements and slid a blank page of an old composition book across for me to sign. "On the back page, please," she said, not looking at me directly. There was a nervousness in how she said it, not the excited kind, but the scared kind. "Don't forget me this time." It landed in my chest like a pebble in a still pond because I hadn't known her name. I hadn't known her at all, but the whole room had the looseness of people who trusted we would be remembered. How could I refuse the request of a quiet kid with a pencil like a talisman? I wrote something cursory and passed the book back. "Don't forget you," I said, because it felt like the thing to say. She nodded once and tucked the page into her lap like a small private treasure. That night, the yearbook slipped under my pillow the way graduation night yearbooks do, heavy with ink and invisible promises. I laughed with friends over pizza and then went home and fell into that strange, in-between sleep the kind of late-night wait brings you. Not quite restful, as if the brain wanted another season of the evening. When I opened my yearbook the next morning, the extra blank page held new handwriting that sent the air out of my lungs. In shaky, uneven letters, someone had written, "I didn't want to leave." Not a note, not a joke, not even a plea. Just that sentence, trailing into the margin like a thing written on the inside of a bruise. I read it 3 times and then a dozen more. At first, I thought a prank. Maybe a friend sneaked in and had a clever, morbid sense of humor. I showed it to Jana and Marco. They shrugged and told me not to be dramatic. I turned the page over and over, searched the edges as if there might be fingerprints pressed into the paper like a map. There was only the handwriting. "Who gave you the extra page?" Jana asked, squinting. "Some girl." "No one told me her name," I answered, and my mouth tasted empty. A ridiculous mounting ache began in my gut. We marched through the day like people with small paper swords, signing things and hugging and smiling for photos. At lunch, I walked back to room 214 to show the teacher, to ask who the girl was. If some freshman had slipped in, someone would know, right? The desk was empty. The folded paper she'd left there was gone. I asked around. Kids shrugged. Someone said they'd seen a girl earlier in the year, but she never spoke. Another offered that she'd moved away. Rumors are shells. The more I pursued it, the less the memory held. Names blurred, descriptions skated at the edges of certainty. People began to look at me like I'd ask for a memory they had already misplaced. So I did the only adult thing I could think of. I checked the graduation list. We all do that in a small town. We check lists, we look at rosters, we want facts that anchor us to the ground. Her name wasn't on it. No one with the face I'd seen, no quiet kid with a folded sheet of paper. I checked alumni posts, the school Facebook, the group chats I was part of. Nothing. It was like the world had a gap where her name ought to be. For a few days, I floated between annoyed and unsettled. The line of that handwriting haunted me. I started replaying things. The way she'd said, "Don't forget me this time," like there had been a first time she'd been forgotten. The yearbook signature request, as if she were trying to graft herself into our story while we still had the chance. Guilt sat under my ribs, thick and useless. I'd signed without knowing, as though an act of ink could bind someone to memory forever. 2 days later, curiosity bit at something sharper. I went to the school library, an old room with a pungent smell of dust and late summer sun, and asked to see earlier yearbooks. The librarian, Mrs. Hargreaves, blinked at me like I'd requested something perverse, but she fetched the cardboard box from the top shelf. I sat cross-legged on the floor among a tower of stale pages and began to flip back through years. High school photography, the awkward, frames, the haircuts frozen like fossils, had always made me feel like an archivist of shallow things. But as I paged through the editions, something unpleasant and precise threaded itself through time. There she was, a pale, thin figure, always at the edge of the frame. 2013, a wide shot of freshman orientation. 2014, a candid in a lab coat that looked as if someone had drawn a smudge across the corner of her face. 2015, a group photo for the English club. In every picture she stood apart, not integrated with smiling classmates but tilted to the side, as if she belonged to a different focal length. My chest went cold. When I compared them closely, the position she occupied didn't seem quite fixed in space, sometimes closer to the camera, sometimes further, like someone who couldn't quite choose where to stand. I looked at the metadata on the binder Mrs. Hargreaves had, a small index with names scribbled and stamped. The girl didn't have a name listed in smaller print the way every other student did. It wasn't that she'd been excluded. It was as if the presence had been tolerated rather than recorded. "What is that?" I asked, voice small. Mrs. Hargreaves came over and glanced at the photo. She turned it gently around and frowned. "That's odd," she said, but the way she said it made me feel like she'd marked a shelf in her memory with a different kind of tag. "Weird kids sometimes drift through, or someone posed and then left. What are you looking for?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Weirdness, memory, a name." She pursed her lips. "I used to do the yearbook," she said eventually, like she was swallowing a date. "Sometimes people asked to be included, wanted to be seen. Other times, well, I don't know. Some images stick." Her hands folded neatly on the table. "Why?" And then I told her everything, the whole stupid thing. The desk, the asking to sign twice, the line on my page. As I spoke, the words became thinner, more ridiculous. When I finished, she surprised me by looking frightened. "You should pack this away," she murmured. "There are always stories that get told about schools, runaways, kids who move away overnight. People want tidy endings, but sometimes—" She stopped. "Sometimes the photos keep things no one talks about." "Like what?" I asked. Because once you open that lever of curiosity, you have to see what it raises. She picked up a different yearbook and thumbed pages until she found a caption. A simple list of names under a class photo. And there it was, tiny and official and horribly bureaucratic. A student roster from 2012 with a name I didn't recognize. I looked cursorily. The name didn't match the face I'd seen. "These records," she said, tapping the paper, "are supposed to be accurate, but sometimes people get lost in the system. Somehow, among all these pages, there are gaps." I left the library with a stack of old yearbooks and a feeling like someone had loosened the screws on my perception. The more I looked, the less fixed the world felt. The photographs did not lie in the way witnesses do, but they also did not tell the whole truth. This thin, translucent girl had a habit of appearing in places and then not appearing at all in the paperwork of living. A week of small, fevered research, internet records, alumni forum threads, old newspaper clippings, produced maybe half a story. No one could recall a kid who'd actually disappeared. The student record secretary told me to put in a formal request for access to archived data. The principal was polite but evasive. Administrators do their best to make messes look tidy. The town's paper office had archives, and there I found a brief notice from 6 years ago. A small obituary for someone named Ellen who'd been in a traffic accident during a winter storm. But the details were hazy, and the name didn't match the face I saw in the pictures. Names were slippery things the way shadows are. The sharpest thing came from a former photographer who'd worked on the yearbook 2 decades earlier. He'd retired to a trailer by the river and spoke slowly, like someone measuring each syllable. "There was always a student," he said, after our first hour of him sifting through memory. "Somebody people felt around. I don't know if she was a student exactly. She showed up in photos, and we'd see her over the years. A lot of people insisted they never saw her in the halls. Some teachers swore she appeared in their attendance logs and then didn't. It's like the building remembers more than the people do." "You're saying people see things differently?" I asked, trying to make his words concrete. "That's what I'm saying," he said. "And some kids, the ones who've lived here, and know when a desk has been moved or a string on a banner is wrong, they remember. But others forget. Or they want to." By then, I was less interested in proving anything than in answering one personal, stupidly human question. Why had she asked me not to forget? After a week, the page in my yearbook changed again. I wasn't present when it happened. I was at my locker, sure, opening and closing it like a sleepwalker. Later that night, I examined it under lamplight. Scratched into the margin in the same shaky handwriting, but this time lighter, as if it had been traced and retraced by someone with a nail, were new words. "Don't forget." The world narrowed to ink and dented paper. I became careful in small ways I had never been before. I said the girl's non-existent name aloud when I walked past room 214. I took to carrying the yearbook with me like armor. I would wake in the night and run my finger over the page until my skin burned. Finally, I quit. Not the investigation, I quit school. It was stupidly dramatic and probably cowardly, but I left with my yearbook in a backpack and a certainty that some things are better avoided than understood. I drove out of town early the next morning. As the highway swallowed the last of the water towers, I thought back on that quiet desk, on the warmth of the pencil I picked up that day, on the words written like an accusation and a plea. I thought about the way houses and schools and roads hold on to people, sometimes long after everyone else forgets to look. A year later, when I came back to visit out of a tired nostalgia, room 214 had a fresh coat of paint. The desk near the window was new. The yearbook in my hands felt like an old animal's tooth. I flipped to the back page one last time and found, in handwriting now faint as a rumor, a new line beneath the others. I could have sworn it wasn't there before. I still don't know who she was. I still don't know why she asked me to sign twice, why she wanted to be remembered on a page that otherwise held names and promises. Maybe she was a student who never finished her story. Maybe she was the accumulation of other people's forgetting. A shape formed out of the space memory leaves when it is careless. Maybe she is a thing the school keeps in its photos because schools keep people in photographs the way old houses keep the smell of a meal forever. What I do know is this. Some requests are small and final. Some pages, once written on, never go blank again. And if you ever find a folded blank page on an untouched desk, with a pencil that feels warm in your hand, even though no one else sits there, be careful what you sign, because you don't always write on a book. Sometimes you answer for a life that thinks the world owes it another chance to be remembered. Story 3. The last day of high school smells like lemon cleaner and old smoke. People laugh in that brittle, triumphant way seniors do. They clump in the courtyard, trading yearbooks and plans, the future sounding like a distant song. I was assigned to the cleanup crew, a favor to the custodian who knew my dad and wanted an extra pair of hands to empty out abandoned lockers. It sounded like a boring, harmless task: sweep, toss, organize. It was supposed to be ordinary. We started after lunch, the hallways quieting as classes dissolved into hugs and goodbyes. The custodians wheeled carts of trash bags behind us. My friend Max moved down the row ahead with a box of trophies from the computer lab. Sarah stacked worn binders into a neat pile. I liked the quiet that comes when most people leave. You can hear the building finally give itself over to rumor and dust. The fluorescents hummed above us, and at the far end of the corridor an exit sign blinked like a patient eye. I was near the end, at the last bank of lockers, when I noticed the smell. Not the high, clean tang of cleaners or the sharp metallic undercurrent of old lockers, but something thicker. Sweet, a little sour, like pennies left in a glass. My nose twitched. This locker always had a slightly different smell, like the material inside had changed the air itself. We all knew who had used it. Locker 321 belonged to Jonah Mays. Jonah's car had hit an oak by the river the previous spring. They said he fell asleep at the wheel, that the road curved at a place it shouldn't, that there were reasons and explanations if anyone wanted to look. People still left small things at the site on weekends: a baseball cap, a chipped mug, a plastic bouquet that curled in the rain. You'd expect his locker to be hollowed out by now, an empty hinge, a nameplate, a history, but when I turned the dial, it clicked on its last number like any other. Inside were the things teenagers leave behind: notebooks with doodles in the margins, a half-empty bag of chips with the top crimped, a scarf folded neatly, a hoodie with Jonah's name scrawled inside the collar. The jacket looked like it had been worn that morning, soft at the elbows, the zipper caught just slightly, but that was impossible. He'd been gone months. I sat down on the cold tile and started sorting. The notebooks were mostly math problems and half-finished doodles: rockets, cartoon eyes, a sloppy comic about finals. In the back of one, between a physics formula and a list of songs, I found a page that made my stomach go cold. The entry was written in a hand I recognized from the cafeteria, slanted and impatient, Jonah's handwriting. I read the last line twice, 3 times, as if the repetition could rearrange the meaning. I'm still here. I can't get out. The letters were small, cramped, like someone trying to hide a confession in the margins. I flipped the page, glanced at the hallway. Max was 2 doors down, Sarah laughing with the custodian, and the lights hummed steady like a low tide. I told myself it was a joke or a bad note written in a bad mood. Teenagers write melodramatic nonsense all the time. I tossed the notebook gently into a box marked recycle and kept going. Then the lights flickered. It was only for a second. The fluorescent strip above me gave a tired buzz and dipped, and the corridor went the color of old paper for a breath. I watched the locker doors along the row like someone watching cards fall. When the lights came back, the same air was there, but thinner somehow. Sarah gave me a look, like she'd felt it too, an instinctual shrug as if to say, "Old building, faulty wiring." And then she laughed and nudged me with her hip. Moving on would be easy. We were all practiced at pretending. I held the locker door open to slide the box in, and the door slammed with a force that made the metal sing. It wasn't a small cafeteria breeze pushing it. It was a boom, like something heavy dropped against steel. The reverberation stuck in my teeth. I jumped back so fast my knees hit the ground. "Dude," Max called from down the hall, voice half teasing, half annoyed. "You okay? You trying to wake the whole school?" The door hung there, closed against my fingers. When I reached for the handle, because you do the obvious thing, because sticking your hand in nothing is better than standing in hurtful silence. The lock clicked once, then again, and the latch rolled into place with that slow, dampened thunk of old metal. There was no wind in the hallway. The windows were latched. No one cursed, no one whooped. A custodial cart squeaked in the distance, and that was all. I tugged at the handle. The locker remained stubbornly shut. I couldn't remember putting my hand on it. It felt like a stupid thing to be unsettled by. Lockers close on their own, doors catch. But there was a small prickle along my spine. The notebook, the sentence, the slam, all the little pieces of a puzzle that doesn't want to fit together. "Everything okay over there?" Sarah shouted, like a friend checking for a bruise. "Yeah," I said too quickly. "Locker just stuck." I laughed and looked away. I pried the door open, and it swung like it always did, small and unremarkable. The light above me hummed again, steady, and somewhere a distant radio buzzed into life with a song I half recognized from the morning announcements. The locker was empty of me. It smelled like metal and old paper. There was no extra presence. I picked up the notebook, and because I was a stupid, curious teenager with too many hours and not enough spine, I read the pages that came before. They were normal at first. Math, boredom, the kind of banal worrying that fills adolescent pages. Then a short paragraph, squeezed between a doodle and a to-do list, wrote itself like a small carved plea. I'm still here. I can't get out. I stared at the words as if they would evaporate. They didn't. I folded the page back against the spine and slipped the notebook into the box with Jonah's hoodie like it was garbage heat, something to be hauled away and never thought of again. That should have been the end of it. The cleanup finished, the lockers emptied. The school returned to its noise, and I went home to a house with real walls and a mother who would ask about my future. But that night's image stuck. I dreamt in the white flicker of fluorescent lights, a corridor forever closing, the sound of metal slamming, a pair of eyes in the dark. 2 days later, Ms. Herbert, the head custodian, texted me on my way to school. "Can you come back after lunch? Need help with that last locker? We found something else in it." When I pushed open the door to the hall that afternoon, the atmosphere felt thinner, like the air had been scooped out of it. The entire cleanup crew had drifted into other duties. I was the only one left with the key ring jingling at my hip. Ms. Herbert gave me a small, solemn nod. "It's been weird," she said. "People keep saying little things, smells, cold spots. Kids saying their phones die when they stand by that locker." She gave me a shape of a small laugh that wasn't funny. "Maybe it's just old wiring, boy. We stood before locker 321 in a hush that made my teeth hurt." The door opened without a fight. Everything looked the same as the afternoon I'd emptied it. Except there was one new thing taped to the back wall with clear packing tape. A sheet of white paper. My fingers shook as I reached in and pulled the paper free. The handwriting was big this time, letters uneven like someone made them with shaking hands. The marker had bled a little into the paper. I read the single sentence, and the air around me seemed to wait for an answer. "Thanks for letting me out." I read it again, then aloud, though my voice sounded like it belonged in a faucet strip. "Thanks for letting me out," I said. The words did something alien in my throat. Ms. Herbert's expression went from mild to small and hard. She reached a hand to her mouth. "There's nobody in the building tonight," she said, voice low. "You sure you didn't? I didn't put that there," I said. My own voice surprised me with stubbornness. "I wouldn't," she nodded, distant. "We keep the place locked. Sometimes, after school, kids sneak in. They make dumb jokes, but not like this." Her eyes scanned the hallway, and then she did something that I realized later she probably did for everyone. She crossed herself. Maybe you should go home for a while, get some air." I agreed, but not because I wanted to. I said sure I'd go, and I left with the paper balling in my fist. On the way out, I passed the yearbook table in the lobby. Seniors were signing each other's editions in messy scrawl and laughing, and the normal world tilted in jagged pieces around the thought of the paper. That night, I couldn't sit through dinner. I couldn't focus on the TV. Every silverware clink sounded like a locker slam. I slept fitfully, dreamlike, not getting the rest that would make sense. At 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of someone breathing. Not in my apartment, not in the house, but in my skull. I forced myself back to sleep, telling myself I was being an idiot and that telling Miss Herbert would fix everything, and that things like locker notes and boys' pranks belonged to teenage drama. But that scrap of paper was in my jeans pocket, a tilt of evidence against my nerves. 2 nights later, I met Max and Sarah one last time before graduation. We'd agreed to exchange numbers again, to keep in touch, as people like to say. The locker had become a quiet joke between us, in the way that all small terrible things try to become jokes. We stood under the same fluorescent lights by 321, the place a magnet for the kind of attention the internet gives curiosities. Someone had taken an Instagram photo with it and captioned it "Haunted Locker" before anyone actually knew what that meant. Max whistled softly as he leaned against the row. "You don't actually believe in this stuff, do you?" he asked half-jokingly. I looked at him, and the air around his mouth seemed too bright. "No, of course not." I wanted to mean it. We were about to leave when the lights dipped again, the same deep, plaintive flicker that had become my signal for wrongness. I felt the weight of the building shift, as if someone brushed the rafters with a long, cold finger. From the back of locker 321 came the tiniest sound, the whisper of paper being folded. Max laughed, a short bark, and I started to laugh too, because what else do you do when something in your life begins to make no sense? We called out Jonas's name as a dare. "Yo, Jonah, you ghosting!" And the joke felt thin. The locker door opened an inch at the top, like someone lifting the lid on a box. For a breath, I thought about screaming. Something moved inside the locker. Not a person, there isn't room, but a shadow that suggested the curve of shoulders, the tense set of someone trying to slip through thin metal. I felt the hair on my arms rise. The door slammed shut with such force that the entire bank of lockers shuddered. The slamming echoed along the corridor and died away, taking with it the laugh and the courage folks like us half summon. Max backed away, eyes wide. Sarah grabbed my sleeve and held on like she meant to pin me to the spot. When we opened the locker again, because opening seemed like the only way to be brave, the interior was empty. Not one thing remained. The hoodie, the notebook, the folded scarf, gone. The only thing inside was the blank white paper I'd read earlier, taped, neat, as if someone had taken a broom and scrubbed the inside clean. My mouth made a sound. No more a word than a suctioning noise. And then I heard Max say something I couldn't bear to register. "We should tell somebody," he said. "But who? The principal? The police? Teenagers like us are half hysteria, half rumor. Adults would chalk it up to boredom and mischief. We all knew that. And yet, the locker had just emptied with a violence that felt like betrayal." "That's it," I said, finally. My voice sounded like a crumpling page. "I'm done with cleanup." I wanted to leave. I wanted the safety of sunlight and traffic. I wanted the simple, banal world where you forget the things you don't want to hold. We left the building and stepped into the afternoon like stolen sailors. Max walked beside me, but we didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. The shape of what happened lived in our mouths like a foreign taste. People congregated on the lawn in circles to take pictures and toss caps in the air. The world went on performing itself, indifferent. On graduation day, as the auditorium emptied and confetti stuck in the seams of shoes, I refused to go past locker 321. They told me later they'd found nothing at all inside, no evidence, no footprints. Facilities had run some cursory check, no cameras, no sign of a break-in. A janitor said he'd seen the door move earlier and had ignored it as ratchet slack. Adults offered a tired explanation. Old building, old wiring, old things. But that paper I'd pulled, the one that read, "Thanks for letting me out," I never told anyone I kept it. I folded it small and slid it into a box with my senior photos. Sometimes at night I take it out and hold it and try to make the words mean something simple. Gratitude, maybe. A prankster's ultimate joke, maybe. A cruelty, maybe. I don't know yet. What I do know is that some doors open only because something inside wants to go out, and some things don't want to be released. I know that sound of metal slamming, sharp enough to rearrange your pulse, and the way a corridor can feel hollowed out like a bone. I know what it's like to stand by a locker and feel the air around you change its mind about who belongs there. I know how a single sheet of paper with a handful of words can make a place stop being just wood and metal and become an invitation. I walk by the school now only when I have to. If I'm honest, I take a different route than before, circling a block, peering down side streets as if I might catch a glimpse of something that wants me. Maybe that's cowardice, maybe that's sense, maybe both. Sometimes at night I wake up and hear a faint scratching, like fingernails on paper, and I reach for my phone, and the light feels small as a match. I think of that locker, of the things left behind by people who stop appearing on rosters and turn into a rumor. I think of Jonah's last scribble. I'm still here, I can't get out, and I am left with the honest, ugly knowledge that the world is not always firm and reliable, that some rooms hold their people past the point anyone means for them to keep them. And the paper? I still keep it. I fold it, and open it, and fold it again. Words are a kind of possession. They are how we hold things. For now, the line in my box is a small, tremulous promise. I won't forget. Those were 3 very scary, true last day of school horror stories. Proof that even when the year ends, some stories don't. Which one chilled you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, if something feels off during the last day of school, don't ignore it. Endings are often where the real stories begin. This is Mr. Dark Horror Stories, signing off.